In 1834, Governor Thaddeus Vale made a declaration so deranged it silenced every man on his brother's Louisiana plantation. He announced he would personally hunt Jonas, the heaviest enslaved man on the property, releasing him into the cypress swamp like a prize animal for the afternoon's entertainment. By sunset, guests were whispering that Jonas had somehow returned alive, and the governor had been dragged out of the mud he sank into during the spectacle. Vale tried to laugh it off, but the humiliation festered. Within days, his soldiers were burning sections of the swamp to flush Jonas out for a second, deadlier hunt. And yet, by the end of that summer, it was the governor's empire that collapsed, not Jonas's body. How did the man he mocked become the force that destroyed him? What happened in that swamp that the governor's allies still refuse to describe? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The first light broke gray over the plantation, casting long shadows across rows of weathered cabins. Jonas worked in silence near the smokehouse, his broad shoulders moving steadily as he lifted barrels of salted pork onto wooden pallets. Each barrel weighed more than most men could manage alone, but Jonas hoisted them with methodical efficiency, his massive frame making the labor appear almost easy. He was a large man, taller than most, and built thick through the chest and arms. His face showed the weathering of middle age, deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the sun. He kept his gaze down as he worked, watching his own hands move through familiar motions. The morning air smelled of smoke and cured meat, mixed with the damp earthiness that rose from the swamp lying just beyond the plantation's cultivated fields. Overseer Brent stood near the main house, arms crossed, watching Jonas with the same look he always wore, a mixture of suspicion and something else, something that looked almost like discomfort. Jonas had learned long ago that his size made people uneasy. White men saw him and immediately wondered if he might be dangerous. Enslaved people sometimes looked at him and wondered why someone so strong remained so quiet. Jonas preferred it that way. Quiet meant invisible. Invisible meant safe. He moved to the next barrel, fingers wrapping around the rough wood. His back ached from yesterday's work in the fields, but he pushed the feeling aside. Pain was just another part of the day, like heat or hunger. He had learned not to give it much attention. "You there?" Brant's voice cut across the morning stillness. "Get yourself cleaned up and get to the front grounds. Governor's coming for inspection." Jonas straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. He nodded once, not speaking. Words were dangerous things that could be twisted and used against you. By mid-morning, the entire enslaved community stood in a long line facing the main house. Jonas took his place at the end, towering over those around him. He could feel eyes on him, always eyes, always watching. An elderly woman named Sarah stood to his left, her thin frame barely reaching his shoulder. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, but her voice came out in a whisper. "Governor Vale himself. Lord help us." Jonas said nothing. He had heard stories about Governor Thaddeus Vale. The man visited his brother's plantation once a year, and each visit brought some new cruelty designed to remind everyone exactly who held power. Last year, he had ordered a young man whipped for looking him in the eye. The year before, he had separated a family, selling the father south just because he felt like it. The sound of horses reached them first. Then came the carriage, fine and black, followed by riders on expensive mounts. Jonas watched through lowered eyes as Governor Vale stepped down, his boots polished to a shine that seemed obscene given the mud and dirt that surrounded them. He was a man of average height, but carried himself as if he were much larger. His face was flushed with the kind of redness that came from too much rich food and wine. Well-dressed guests followed him, men in fine coats and women with parasols. all of them looking at the assembled people with the same detached curiosity, they might show a herd of cattle. Vale walked slowly down the line, hands clasped behind his back. He stopped occasionally to examine someone more closely, sometimes making comments that drew laughter from his guests. Jonas kept his breathing steady, his expression carefully blank. The governor moved closer. Jonas could smell expensive tobacco and cologne. Vale stopped directly in front of him. "Well, now." The governor's voice carried a note of amusement. "What have we here?" Jonas kept his eyes down, studying the dust at Vale's feet. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Jonas raised his gaze slowly, meeting the governor's eyes for just a moment before dropping them again. That was the trick. Acknowledge the command, but don't hold the look long enough to seem defiant. Remarkable size. Vale circled around him, and Jonas felt the inspection like hands crawling across his skin. "How much can you lift?" "Whatever needs lifting, sir." Jonas kept his voice low and respectful. Vale laughed, a sharp sound that made Jonas's stomach tighten. "I'll bet you can. Tell me, do you know what they do with large animals where I come from?" Jonas said nothing. There was no safe answer to that question. "They hunt them." Vale's smile widened. "For sport. Test their endurance, their cunning." He turned to his guests, raising his voice. "Gentlemen, ladies, I believe we have an opportunity for genuine entertainment. A sporting spectacle to make this inspection memorable." Murmurs rippled through the assembled guests. Jonas felt Sarah stiffen beside him. "This specimen here," Vale gestured at Jonas like he was pointing out an interesting rock, "will demonstrate whether his size translates to any real survival ability. We're going to have ourselves a proper hunt through that cypress swamp." The words hung in the air. Jonas felt his heart begin to pound, but he kept his face still. Brant stepped forward eagerly. "Sir, the swamp's dangerous terrain. Quicksand, snakes. Exactly what makes it interesting." Vale's eyes glittered. "Strip him of any tools. Give him a 10-minute head start. Then we ride." Hands grabbed Jonas, pulling him forward. Someone took the small knife he carried for cutting rope. Another removed his shoes. The world seemed to narrow to a single point of terrible clarity. This was happening. This was actually happening. Vale's guests mounted their horses, their faces bright with anticipation. Jonas was pushed toward the tree line where the cultivated land gave way to wild growth. "Run, boy!" Vale called out, checking his rifle. "Let's see what you're made of." Jonas looked at the swamp, the thick trunks rising from dark water, the hanging moss, the shadows that seemed to swallow light. Behind him, he heard Vale begin counting. 1. Jonas started walking. 2. Then he was running, his bare feet finding purchase on roots and mud, his massive frame crashing through undergrowth as he plunged into the green darkness. 3. Behind him, Vale's voice rose in pitch, excited and eager. 10. Mount up, gentlemen. Jonas pushed deeper into the swamp as the sound of horses and baying hounds filled the morning air. Jonas pushed past low branches, his breath coming heavy from fear and exertion. Spanish moss slapped against his face as he ran, leaving damp trails across his skin. The swamp closed around him like a fist. Thick cypress trunks rising from water, the color of old tea. Roots twisted into shapes that could break an ankle. Behind him, the baying of hounds cut through the morning air. Distant, but getting closer. His bare feet found purchase on submerged roots, toes gripping bark worn smooth by water. The mud sucked at his heels with each step, trying to hold him in place. He had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the swamp's edge, maybe less. Think. Don't just run. Think. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Old man Harlan, dead these 3 years now, crouched beside him during a rare moment of rest in the far fields. Harlan had been ancient even then, his hands gnarled like the roots Jonas now climbed over. He had spoken in whispers about paths through the swamp, trails that didn't look like trails, ways of reading the land that came from people who had lived here long before plantations carved up the earth. "See how the moss hangs thicker on the north side?" Harlan had said, pointing to a distant tree. "And where the water looks still but ain't stagnant, that's where the old paths run." The Chitimacha people knew every inch of this swamp. They built on the high ground, traveled on the firm ground. You just got to know how to see it. Jonas stopped running, forcing himself to stand still despite every instinct screaming at him to keep moving. He looked at the trees around him. The moss did hang heavier on one side, and there, a barely visible line through the water where the surface rippled differently, suggesting solid ground beneath. He moved left, following the subtle trail. His breathing slowed. The panic that had driven him began to sharpen into something more focused. The dogs sounded closer now. He could hear men's voices, veils cutting above the others. He went straight in, probably already stuck or snake-bit. Jonas kept moving, placing each foot carefully where the old path seemed to guide him. The water here came only to his ankles instead of his knees, firm ground, just like Harlan had said. He moved faster, following the invisible line through growth so thick it would have seemed impassable to anyone who didn't know the secret. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in thin shafts of light. Jonas's legs burned. His lungs ached, but the sounds of the hunt kept shifting, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. He was staying ahead of them. At one point, he heard Vale's voice rise in frustration. Where the hell did he go? Nothing that size just disappears. Jonas allowed himself the smallest feeling of satisfaction. Let them be confused. Let them wonder. He emerged into a clearing where the trees opened up around a marshy expanse. The water here looked calm, almost inviting. But Jonas remembered Harlan's warnings. The pretty water's the dangerous water. Looks peaceful because nothing can live in it. Too much silt, too much pull. This was the place Harlan had called the Hungry Hollow. Ground that looked solid but would swallow a man whole if he trusted it. Jonas moved carefully around the edge, testing each step before committing his weight. Behind him, the dogs grew louder. They had picked up his scent again. He needed to cross to the other side, where thick palmetto growth would hide his trail. But there was no clear path through the marsh. He would have to trust his memory of Harlan's instructions, find the stable spots by watching how the reeds grew, where the water pooled versus where it seemed to drain. He started across, moving from one small island of firm ground to another. Each step was a gamble. The mud pulled at his feet, but released them when he shifted his weight properly. Halfway across, he heard horses crashing through the undergrowth behind him. Vale's party had reached the clearing. "There!" someone shouted. Jonas kept moving, not looking back. 3 more steps to solid ground. "He's heading for the marsh," another voice called. "We can cut him off on the other side." Vale's voice rang out, sharp with anger and something else, something that sounded like desperation to prove himself after being made to look foolish. "Follow him. If he can cross it, so can we." Jonas heard the splash of horses entering the water behind him. He reached the far side and turned, crouching low in the palmetto. Vale rode at the front of the group, his face red with exertion and fury. He pushed his horse forward, following the path Jonas had taken, except he wasn't watching where Jonas had stepped. He was simply charging ahead, driven by pride and rage. "Governor," one of the other riders called. "Maybe we should—" "Keep moving," Vale snapped. The horse took 2 more steps. Then its front legs plunged downward, disappearing into mud that had looked solid. The animal screamed, thrashing. Vale pitched forward, his hands grabbing for the reins. The horse managed to pull itself back toward firmer ground, but Vale slid from the saddle, landing with a wet splash in the marsh. For a moment, he simply sat there, covered in mud. Then he tried to stand. His legs sank deeper. "Sir!" The other riders pulled up short, their horses stamping nervously at the edge of the dangerous ground. Vale's eyes went wide. He was in the Hungry Hollow proper now, the place where the silt pulled and didn't let go. His arms flailed as he tried to find purchase. Jonas watched from the palmetto. He should run. This was his chance to disappear while they dealt with their own disaster. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to move, to take this gift and use it. But he didn't move. He thought of Sarah, standing in the line this morning. He thought of the children in the cabins. If the governor drowned in this swamp, if Jonas ran, every enslaved person on that plantation would pay the price. They would be whipped, sold, separated. The cruelty that would follow would be total. Jonas stood up. "Don't thrash," he called out, his voice carrying across the marsh. "You'll sink faster." Vale's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing with humiliation and fear. Jonas moved back across the marsh, stepping carefully on the same stable points he had used before. He reached Vale and extended one massive arm. "Take my hand. Don't pull. Let me lift." Vale stared at him for a long moment. Then, with visible reluctance, he grasped Jonas's hand. Jonas planted his feet and pulled steadily, using his size and strength to draw Vale from the sucking mud. The governor came free with a wet sound, covered in black silt from chest to boots. The watching riders sat frozen in their saddles, silent. Jonas helped Vale to stable ground, then stepped back quickly, head lowered. Vale stood there dripping, his fine clothes ruined, his dignity shredded in front of his wealthy guests. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. Jonas could see the fury building in his eyes, not gratitude, but pure humiliation at being saved by the very man he had been hunting. "Get him back to the house," Vale said quietly, his voice shaking, under supervision. Hands grabbed Jonas's arms. He didn't resist as they led him back through the swamp, retracing their path. The ride back to the plantation passed in silence. Jonas walked between the horses, mud caked on his legs, his body exhausted beyond measure. At the plantation, the guests dismounted quickly, their voices hushed but urgent. Jonas caught fragments of whispered conversations as they hurried toward the main house. "Did you see? Actually saved him. How embarrassing." Brant appeared, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "Get to your quarters. Now." Jonas walked slowly across the grounds. Other enslaved people watched from doorways and fields, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes questioning. He couldn't look at them, couldn't bear to see hope or fear or anything else reflected there. He reached the small cabin he shared with 3 other men and pushed inside. The others were still in the fields. He was alone. Jonas lowered himself onto his pallet, every muscle screaming. His feet were cut and bleeding from the run through the swamp. His hands trembled from exhaustion. He lay back, staring at the rough boards of the ceiling. Above him, in the main house, he could hear footsteps moving back and forth. Heavy footsteps. The governor's footsteps. Jonas closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. He listened to those footsteps pace across the floorboards, back and forth, and wondered what punishment was being planned in that angry, humiliated mind. Morning came too quickly. Jonas woke to someone shaking his shoulder roughly. "Doctor needs help in the storage room," Brant said from the doorway. "Get up." Jonas rose stiffly, his body protesting every movement. The cuts on his feet had scabbed over during the night, cracking open fresh as he stood. He followed Brant across the yard to the main house, through the kitchen entrance, and down a narrow hallway to a small room where medical supplies were kept. The plantation doctor, a thin man named Carlyle, was organizing bottles on a wooden shelf. He glanced at Jonas with brief acknowledgement, then returned to his work. "Hold this," Carlyle said, handing Jonas a wooden crate. "And that trunk. Need to reach the back shelf." Jonas took the items and stood silently, while the doctor rummaged through dusty containers. The room smelled of camphor and something sharper, medicinal. Through the thin wall, Jonas could hear voices in the next room. The governor's study. "I'm telling you, it's a serious condition," Carlyle was saying to someone in there. His voice carried clearly. "The strain yesterday could have killed you." Vale's voice responded, quieter but tense. "It was nothing. A moment of exertion." "It wasn't nothing," Carlyle insisted. "Your heart is weakening, Thaddeus. The palpitations, the shortness of breath. These aren't minor concerns. You need to avoid situations of high stress. No more hunting expeditions, no more physical confrontations. Your body can't sustain that kind of strain anymore." There was a long pause. Jonas stood perfectly still, holding the crate, his face carefully empty. "How long?" Vale asked finally. "How long for what? How long do I have before this thing kills me?" Another pause. When Carlyle spoke again, his voice was gentler. "That depends entirely on how carefully you manage it. Years, potentially, if you avoid stress and excitement. But if you continue pushing yourself the way you did yesterday—" He let the implication hang. "I see," Vale said quietly. Jonas heard footsteps moving away, a door closing. He stood motionless, the crate growing heavy in his arms. The doctor in the storage room seemed oblivious to the conversation that had just occurred, still sorting through bottles with methodical focus. "Put those down," Carlyle said without turning. "I found what I needed." Jonas set the items down carefully and backed toward the door. Carlyle waved him away with one hand, already absorbed in measuring out some powder into a small envelope. Jonas stepped into the hallway. His mind was turning over what he had heard, filing it away in the careful manner he had learned for storing information that might prove useful later. The governor's heart was weak. The governor feared dying. The hunt yesterday had been dangerous for Vale, not just for Jonas. A door opened further down the hall. A woman emerged, her dress a pale blue that seemed almost gray in the dim light. Evelyn Vale, the governor's wife. Jonas had seen her before, of course, but always at a distance. She was younger than her husband by perhaps 15 years, her face composed and intelligent. She carried herself with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to move through powerful spaces without drawing unwanted attention. She saw Jonas and paused. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're the one who pulled my husband from the marsh yesterday," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Jonas lowered his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Look at me, please." He raised his head, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were dark, assessing him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving his life." Jonas didn't know how to respond to that. Gratitude from people like her usually came with conditions, with expectations of further servitude. He remained silent. Evelyn reached into a pocket of her dress and withdrew something small that caught the light. A silver locket on a thin chain. She held it out toward him. "Take this," she said, "as a token of my appreciation." Jonas hesitated. Accepting gifts from the governor's wife seemed dangerous, a trap waiting to spring. "Take it," she repeated, pressing it into his hand. Her fingers were cool against his palm. "I've already spoken to my husband about your action yesterday, about how you showed mercy when you could have simply run. That kind of character should be recognized." She leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping even lower. "There may be opportunity for favor in the future, perhaps even a path toward manumission in time. These things can be arranged, if the right people advocate for them." Hope flickered in Jonas's chest, small and fragile. He closed his fingers around the locket, feeling its weight. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed. Evelyn studied his face for another moment, then nodded. "Go, before someone questions why we're speaking." Jonas moved past her quickly, the locket burning in his palm like a hot coal. He made his way back outside, his mind spinning. Could it be real? Could there actually be a chance at freedom? at being recognized as something more than property? The afternoon passed in a haze of regular work. Jonas moved through his tasks mechanically, his thoughts circling back again and again to Evelyn's words. The locket hung around his neck now, hidden beneath his shirt, a constant reminder of possibility. But as evening approached, the atmosphere on the plantation began to shift. Jonas noticed it first in the way the overseers moved, with tension in their shoulders, wariness in their eyes. Something had changed in the main house. Supper came and went. The enslaved community gathered in small groups outside their quarters, speaking in low voices, passing around what little food they had saved from the day's rations. Jonas sat apart from the others, his back against the cabin wall. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He touched the locket through his shirt, drawing what comfort he could from its presence. Then he heard the footsteps, heavy boots on packed earth, multiple sets. Coming toward the quarters yard, the conversation stopped. Everyone turned toward the sound. Governor Vale emerged from the shadows between buildings, flanked by Brant and two other overseers. Even in the fading light, Jonas could see the fury in Vale's face, the rigid set of his shoulders. The governor's eyes swept across the assembled people, then locked onto Jonas. "Stand up," Vale commanded. Jonas rose slowly, his heart beginning to pound. The locket felt suddenly cold against his chest. Vale stepped forward, his voice carrying across the yard. "Last night, I listened to my guests discuss yesterday's events. They found it amusing. The governor of Louisiana, they said, rescued by his own property, pulled from the mud like a child by a man he was meant to be hunting." His voice rose with each word, rage bleeding through the careful control. "They laughed. Do you understand? They stood in my house drinking my whiskey, and they laughed at me." No one spoke. The entire yard had gone silent, breath held. "At dawn tomorrow," Vale continued, "there will be another hunt, but this time there will be no mistakes, no mercy, no salvation." His eyes remained fixed on Jonas. "This time, it ends with a body." Sarah made a small sound of horror from somewhere in the crowd. Other voices rose in dismay, quickly stifled. Vale's smile was cold and terrible. "He'll be released at first light. Dogs, riders, rifles. And when we find him—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Brant stepped forward. "Everyone to quarters. Now." The crowd dispersed quickly, people hurrying to their cabins with frightened glances back at Jonas. Sarah lingered for a moment, her face stricken, before someone pulled her away. Jonas stood alone in the yard as the overseers departed, following Vale back toward the main house. The governor's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only silence and the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Jonas sat down slowly on the ground outside his cabin. He pulled the locket from beneath his shirt and held it in his palm, staring at its polished surface. His moment of mercy had sealed his fate. By saving Vale's life, he had humiliated him beyond forgiveness. The governor's pride mattered more than any gratitude, more than his wife's promises, more than anything resembling human decency. Tomorrow, he would run again. But this time, there would be no coming back. Jonas closed his fist around the locket and looked up at the moon rising above the trees. It was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the yard. By this time tomorrow night, he would either be dead or so deep in the swamp that no one would ever find him. He took a slow breath and began to prepare himself mentally for what dawn would bring. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to gray to a pale, sickly yellow. Jonas stood in the quarters yard, flanked by Brant and another overseer whose name he had never learned. His wrists were free, but his arms felt heavy as iron. More men arrived on horseback. Jonas counted 6 riders, each armed with rifles. The dogs came next, 4 of them, straining against their handlers' grips. Their bodies were lean and muscular, bred for hunting runaways. Their barking echoed across the yard, sharp and eager. The enslaved community had been ordered to stay in their cabins, but Jonas could see faces pressed against windows, eyes watching through cracks indoors. Sarah stood in the doorway of her cabin, her hand pressed against her mouth. He met her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Governor Vale emerged from the main house as the sun broke over the tree line. He moved more slowly than usual, his face pale beneath his hat. Jonas thought of the doctor's words from yesterday, the warning about stress and excitement. The governor looked like a man who had not slept well, but his eyes were hard with determination. He mounted his horse with visible effort, settling into the saddle with a grimace that he tried to hide. "Bring him forward," Vale commanded. Brant shoved Jonas toward the gathering. The riders formed a loose circle around him, their horses stamping and shifting. One of the dogs lunged forward, snarling, until its handler jerked it back. Vale looked down at Jonas from his horse. "You understand the terms. When the horn sounds, you run. We follow. This ends when we find you." Jonas said nothing. There was nothing to say. Vale turned to one of his guests, a florid-faced man with mutton-chop whiskers who had ridden out to observe the spectacle. "Sound the horn." The man raised a brass hunting horn to his lips. The note cut through the morning air, long and clear and terrible. Jonas ran. He sprinted toward the swamp edge, his feet pounding against the earth. Behind him came the sound of men shouting, dogs barking, horses beginning to move. But he had a head start. Precious seconds before the hunters would organize themselves into pursuit. He crashed into the underbrush at the swamp's border, branches whipping across his face and arms. The terrain grew softer immediately, the solid ground giving way to mud and standing water. He pushed deeper, using his size and strength to force his way through vegetation that would have stopped a smaller man. This time he went further than before, past the trails Old Man Harlan had shown him, into territory he knew only from distant observation. The water rose to his knees, then his thighs. Cypress trees towered around him, their roots creating a labyrinth of natural barriers. The sound of the dogs grew louder. They had picked up his scent. Jonas climbed onto a massive fallen log, using its length to cross a stretch of open water. The bark was slippery with moss, but he kept his balance, moving as quickly as he dared. At the far end, he dropped back into the water and changed direction, heading northeast instead of west. Behind him, smoke began to rise above the trees. They were burning sections of undergrowth, trying to flush him out. Jonas could smell it on the wind, acrid and threatening. He moved faster, his breath coming hard. The water grew deeper. He passed through a grove of dead trees, their bare branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. A water moccasin slithered past his leg, and he froze, waiting for it to pass, then continued forward. The sun climbed higher. Jonas had no way to measure time except by its position, but he guessed it was nearly midday when he stumbled onto the settlement. It wasn't much. 3 small shelters made from salvaged wood and palmetto fronds, built on a raised section of land surrounded by water. A cooking fire sat cold and abandoned. Clothes hung drying on a makeshift line. 2 men appeared from the largest shelter, both holding knives. One was tall and cautious-looking, his face scarred on one side. The other was younger, his movements quick and alert. "Don't come closer," the older one said. His voice was rough but controlled. Jonas raised his hands slowly. "I'm being hunted. Governor's men. I just need water. Then I'll go." The younger man glanced at his companion. "We heard dogs earlier." "That's them," Jonas confirmed. "Following me? I won't stay. I don't want to bring trouble." An elderly woman emerged from the second shelter. She was small and bent with age, but her eyes were sharp as she studied Jonas. "You're the one they hunted yesterday," she said. It wasn't a question. "Word travels, even out here. The big man who saved the governor, and now the governor wants him dead. Jonas nodded. The older man with the scar lowered his knife slightly. I'm Caleb. This is Kofi. The elder is Mother Asha. Jonas. Mother Asha moved forward, her feet bare and sure on the uneven ground. You pulled a man from quicksand, and he repays you with death. That's the way of this world, she gestured toward the cold fire. There's water in the pot. Take what you need. Jonas approached carefully, aware of Caleb's eyes tracking his every movement. He found a clay pot filled with rainwater and drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing his raw throat. How long you been out here? He asked between swallows. 2 years, Caleb said. Maybe longer. Time's different in the swamp. Kofi moved to the edge of the platform, scanning the surrounding trees. You should go. Governor's men find us. They'll kill everyone here. They don't leave witnesses. I know, Jonas said. He set the pot down. I'm sorry for bringing danger. Mother Asha stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. Her fingers were thin and cold. They've killed runaways before. Hung them in the town square as warnings. The governor won't stop until you're dead or so far gone he can pretend you never existed. Then I'll go far, Jonas said. He climbed down from the platform back into the water. Caleb watched him go, his expression unreadable. Good luck, the scarred man said quietly. Jonas nodded and moved away from the settlement, heading deeper into the swamp. He had gone perhaps 100 yards when he heard the first gunshot. The crack echoed across the water, followed by another. The hunters were close, closer than he had thought. Jonas dropped low and moved quickly toward a massive fallen cypress trunk, its hollowed interior large enough to hide a man. He crawled inside, pulling handfuls of moss and debris over the opening. The sound of horses came through the water, splashing. Men's voices calling to each other. Jonas pressed himself against the rotting wood and held his breath as the riders passed within 20 feet of his hiding place. The riders moved past Jonas's hiding place, their horses' hooves churning mud and water. Jonas remained motionless inside the fallen cypress trunk, counting his breaths until the sounds faded into the distance. Only when silence returned did he carefully push aside the moss and debris covering the opening. Early afternoon light filtered through the canopy above. Jonas crawled out of his hiding spot, his clothes soaked and stinking of rot. His hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. Something had shifted inside him during those minutes pressed against decaying wood, listening to men discuss hunting him like an animal. He could keep running, keep hiding. But the riders would keep searching, keep burning, keep destroying everything in their path. Mother Asha's words echoed in his mind. The governor won't stop. Jonas looked down at his hands. They were large, powerful, capable. Old Man Harlan had taught him the hidden trails, but Harlan had also taught him something else during their quiet conversations in the fields. He had taught him to think like the land itself, to understand how water flowed and trees grew, how animals moved and hunters tracked. If Jonas understood the swamp, he could use it. He began moving again, but this time with different purpose. He wasn't fleeing blindly anymore. He was planning. The first trap was simple. Jonas found a natural depression in the ground, where water had pooled, surrounded by solid-looking vegetation. He carefully removed the vegetation in a wide circle, revealing the mud beneath, then replaced it loosely so it appeared undisturbed. From a distance, it would look like safe ground. Step on it, and rider or horse would plunge through into knee-deep muck. He built 3 more similar traps along what he guessed would be the rider's most likely paths, marking each location in his memory by distinctive trees or rock formations. Next, he created false trails. Jonas doubled back on his own path, then broke off at sharp angles, leaving clear footprints in mud before scrambling up onto roots and logs, where his weight would leave no trace. He disturbed vegetation deliberately in one direction, then traveled in another. He wanted to scatter the hunting party, divide their attention. As the sun moved westward, Jonas heard voices again. He climbed into the branches of a massive live oak, its limbs thick enough to support his weight, and watched as two riders passed below. "Governor's gone mad," one of them muttered, "ordering us to burn half the damn swamp." "His heart's the problem," the other replied. "Doctor said no excitement, but look at him. Red-faced and shaking like he's gonna drop dead any minute. If he dies out here, we're all gonna hang for it." They moved on, but Jonas remained in the tree, processing what he had heard. Vale was pushing himself beyond what his body could endure, driven by humiliation and rage. The governor's obsession with ending this hunt was making him reckless, dangerous. Jonas climbed down carefully. As his feet touched ground, pain shot through his left ankle. He had landed awkwardly on a hidden root. He tested his weight carefully, wincing. The ankle was tender but not broken. He could still walk, still move, though each step sent a dull ache up his leg. He pushed forward. Pain was nothing new. The smell of smoke grew stronger as afternoon wore toward evening. Jonas saw columns of gray rising above the trees in 3 different locations. They were burning large sections now, systematic and thorough. The birds had gone silent, fled from their nests. A deer crashed through the underbrush nearby, running from the flames. Jonas thought of Caleb and Kofi, of Mother Asha. He thought of the other runaways who must be hiding in this swamp, people who had risked everything for a chance at freedom. Vale's fires threatened all of them. The governor didn't care who else suffered as long as he destroyed Jonas. The moral weight of it settled on Jonas like a physical burden. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. Vale had to be stopped. Not just escaped, but how could an enslaved man stop a governor? Jonas moved through a grove of palmetto palms as dusk approached, his injured ankle throbbing with each step. The ground began to rise slightly, becoming drier. He noticed something unusual ahead. Straight lines where nature should curve. The corner of a structure hidden behind vegetation. He pushed through a curtain of Spanish moss and found himself standing before a small wooden shed. It was old but maintained, its boards weathered but solid. A heavy padlock secured the door. Jonas looked around carefully. No one in sight. The nearest smoke column was perhaps half a mile away. He found a large rock and smashed the padlock with 3 heavy blows. The metal gave way with a crack. Jonas pulled the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by light filtering through gaps in the walls. Jonas's eyes adjusted slowly. He saw crates stacked against one wall, iron shackles hanging from hooks, coils of rope. The space smelled of mildew and something else, something chemical and harsh. This wasn't a plantation storage shed. This was something hidden, something secret. Jonas approached the nearest crate and pried it open with his fingers, the wood splintering under his strength. Inside he found papers, dozens of them, bundled with twine. He lifted one bundle and moved toward the doorway, where the light was better. The top document was a bill of sale, dated 6 months earlier. Jonas could read. Old man Harlan had taught him letters in secret, and what he read made his blood run cold. Purchase of 1 Negro woman. Charity. Free papers claimed, but disputed. The signature at the bottom was elaborate and unmistakable. Thaddeus Vale, Governor. Jonas's hands trembled as he unfolded the next document. Another bill of sale. Another kidnapping of someone who had been legally free. Then another. And another. He knelt on the shed's dirt floor, papers spread around him, staring at Governor Vale's signature repeated again and again on documents that proved systematic, deliberate crimes. Vale wasn't just cruel. He was a criminal, trafficking in stolen lives, kidnapping free black people and selling them into bondage. Jonas's breathing came faster. His fingers traced over the governor's name, each loop and flourish of the signature representing lives destroyed. families torn apart. He had found the governor's greatest secret, and secrets, Jonas understood in that moment, could be more powerful than any weapon. Jonas pulled more documents from the crate, moving closer to the doorway, where the fading twilight gave him just enough light to read. His hands moved methodically now, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The second bundle contained more bills of sale, but these were different. Instead of names, there were numbers, inventory lists. 6 adult males, ages estimated 20-35, certificates of freedom confiscated. The words blurred together as Jonas forced himself to keep reading. He recognized a name on the 4th document. Samuel Freeman. Jonas knew that name. 3 years ago, Samuel had been a free carpenter in New Orleans, had traveled upriver to visit family. He never returned. His wife had come to the plantation asking questions, desperate and afraid. The overseer had turned her away, threatened her with dogs if she came back. Samuel Freeman's bill of sale was dated 2 weeks after his disappearance. Jonas's throat tightened. He set that paper aside carefully, as if it were sacred, because it was proof. Proof that the rumors were true, that free people weren't safe, that Vale's cruelty extended far beyond what anyone knew. He found more names he recognized from whispered conversations, from the stories enslaved people shared in the quarters when overseers weren't listening. Mary Johnson, Isaac Williams, Patience Green, all supposedly free, all vanished, all reduced to lines on Vale's documents, sold as property despite their legal status. Jonas counted 18 separate transactions over the past 4 years, 18 lives stolen. And these were only the documents in this one crate. He noticed something else as he rifled through the papers, small notations in different handwriting, lighter ink, added in margins, Patience Green, 2 children left in N.O. One note read, Isaac Williams, worked at docks, many witnesses to freedom status. Someone had been documenting additional information that would make these crimes even more damning if exposed. Jonas moved to the second crate, forcing it open with a sharp pull that made the wood groan. This one contained personal items, small bundles of clothing, prayer books, a child's wooden toy. Things taken from victims, perhaps. Things that proved they had existed as real people, not just inventory numbers. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, Jonas found a collection of identical silver lockets. He lifted one carefully, holding it up to catch the dying light. It was the same design as the locket Evelyn Vale had given him, the same delicate etching around the edge. Jonas opened it. Inside was a tiny piece of paper with a date and initials, P.G., Sept. 1836, Patience Green, September of last year. He opened another locket, M.J., Jan. 1835, Mary Johnson. Each locket contained similar notations. Jonas's chest constricted as he understood. These weren't random trinkets. These were records, evidence collected deliberately and hidden here, marked with information that could identify victims. Evelyn Vale hadn't just given him a token of kindness. She had given him a key to understanding her husband's operation. She had been tracking these crimes, documenting them, waiting for someone trustworthy enough to receive the information. Jonas thought of her quiet thanks after he had saved the governor, her careful words about favor and possibility. She had known her husband would react with violence. She had prepared for this moment. He selected several of the most damning documents, bills of sale with Vale's signature clearly visible, the annotated pages showing systematic operations, proof of dates and names. He folded them carefully and tucked them inside his shirt, against his skin where they would stay dry. Then he took 2 extra lockets, sliding them into his pocket. The physical evidence felt heavy against his chest, not from weight, but from meaning. Jonas rested on the shed floor for nearly an hour as full darkness fell outside. His ankle throbbed and his body ached from days of running, but his mind raced with possibilities. He had found something the governor couldn't outrun. The truth of his crimes, documented in his own hand. But what could an enslaved man do with such knowledge? If Jonas died in this swamp, the papers would rot with him. If he was captured, they would be destroyed before anyone saw them. He needed help. He needed people who could understand what these documents meant and what to do with them. He thought of Mother Asha, of Caleb, and Kofi. They had warned him the governor never left survivors, but they had also survived this long by knowing when to fight and when to hide. Perhaps together they could find a way. Jonas stood slowly, testing his ankle. It hurt, but it would carry him. He took one last look around the shed, committing details to memory. Then he stepped back into the night. The swamp was different in darkness. Sounds multiplied. Frogs, insects, the splash of creatures moving through water. Jonas moved carefully, using the moon when it broke through clouds to guide him. His injured ankle forced him to go slower than he wanted, but he knew rushing would only lead to worse injury. It took him 2 hours to reach the area where he thought the maroon camp was hidden. He stopped frequently, listening for any sign of the hunters. The smoke smell had faded, suggesting they had stopped burning for the night. They would resume at dawn. Jonas found the lightning-struck cypress that marked the approach to the camp. He gave the low whistle Mother Asha had taught runaways to use. 3 short notes, 1 long. A moment later, the signal came back. 2 short notes. Jonas pushed through the palmetto screen and entered the small clearing. A low fire burned in a carefully concealed pit, its smoke dispersed by overhead branches. Mother Asha sat near it, working a needle through leather. Caleb and Kofi stood at opposite edges of the camp, keeping watch. Mother Asha looked up as Jonas approached. Her weathered face showed no surprise, only tired recognition. "You came back." "I found something," Jonas said. He sat heavily near the fire, his ankle grateful for the rest. Kofi moved closer, his hand resting on a makeshift club. "Found what?" Jonas pulled the documents from his shirt. They were slightly damp with sweat, but intact. He spread them near the firelight, explaining what each one represented. He showed them the lockets, explained the notations, described the signature that appeared again and again. Mother Asha's expression grew darker as she examined the papers. She couldn't read, but she understood what Jonas was telling her. Caleb, who could read a little, traced the words with 1 finger, his jaw tightening. "Governor's been stealing free people," Caleb said quietly, "selling them like they was never free at all." "For years," Jonas added. "Maybe longer than what's in that shed." Kofi shook his head. "What good does knowing do us? We can't take this to no law. They'd hang us for breaking into his property." "He's right," Caleb said. "Even with papers, we're still just runaways. Nobody gonna believe us over a governor." Mother Asha set down her needlework. She looked at Jonas for a long moment, her eyes reflecting firelight. "You thinking to confront him with this? Face to face?" Jonas nodded slowly. "It's the only leverage strong enough. If I threaten to expose him, maybe he'll stop the hunt. Maybe he'll let people go. Maybe he'll kill you where you stand," Kofi said bluntly. "Maybe," Jonas agreed. "But running hasn't worked. Hiding hasn't worked. The governor won't stop until I'm dead, and he'll burn this whole swamp doing it. Other people will die. You might die." Mother Asha picked up one of the documents, holding it close to the fire. "My daughter was taken 10 years back. Free woman. Had papers from her master's will. Was walking to market one day, never came home. Overseers said she must have run off, but I always wondered." She set the paper down carefully. "This kind of evil needs witnessing, needs accounting. How would we even do this?" Caleb asked. "Governor's got armed men, horses, dogs." Jonas leaned forward. "There's a burned clearing about 2 miles east of here. Open ground, nowhere to hide. If I go there at first light, send up smoke to draw them in, I can make them listen. The clearing's too exposed for them to rush me without me seeing them coming. I can speak from high ground." And if they just shoot you? Kofi pressed. Then someone else has to carry these papers out, Jonas said. Someone has to get them to people who can use them. The governor's wife, maybe. She's been collecting this evidence. She wants him stopped. Mother Asha stood, her joints creaking. You asking us to help you prepare for this confrontation? Yes. She looked at Caleb and Kofi. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Finally, Caleb nodded. Kofi hesitated, then did the same. We'll help, Mother Asha said. But we prepare for every outcome. You might win, you might die. We make sure the truth survives either way. They worked through the remaining hours of darkness. Caleb and Kofi gathered materials from around the camp. Stakes, rope, anything that could serve as defense. Mother Asha showed Jonas how to position himself in the clearing for maximum visibility and protection, using the terrain itself as shield. They discussed contingencies, backup plans, ways to ensure the documents reached safety if things went wrong. Jonas practiced speaking aloud what he would say to Vale, finding words that were clear and strong. Mother Asha listened, correcting him when emotion overcame clarity, helping him craft statements that would cut through the governor's rage. As night deepened toward morning, they built a small signal fire at the edge of camp, ready to be lit when the time came. The smoke would draw the hunting party directly to the clearing. Finally, there was nothing left to prepare. The plan was as solid as they could make it. Caleb and Kofi settled at the camp's edges to rest while keeping watch. Mother Asha sat near the central fire, her presence steady and calm. Jonas lay down near the warmth, the documents still tucked against his chest. His ankle throbbed, his body ached, but something else burned inside him now, something that had nothing to do with pain. He closed his eyes, knowing sleep would come in fragments, if at all. Tomorrow he would face the governor. Tomorrow everything would change. The pre-dawn haze hung thick over the swamp like wet wool. Jonas walked in silence, Mother Asha on one side, Caleb and Kofi flanking him. They moved through palmetto groves and around standing water, following a path that would bring them to the burned clearing from the east. The air smelled of ash and damp earth. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say. Jonas carried the documents wrapped in oilcloth that Mother Asha had provided, tucked inside a leather pouch slung across his chest. The 2 extra lockets were in his pocket, their weight a constant reminder of Evelyn Vale's silent resistance. His ankle still hurt, but adrenaline dulled the pain to background noise. They reached the edge of the clearing just as gray light began filtering through the canopy. The burned area stretched before them, maybe 200 yards across. Blackened tree stumps rose from scorched earth like broken teeth. At the far end, a natural ridge of limestone lifted about 8 feet above the clearing floor, high enough to give visibility, defensible enough to make rushing him difficult. Mother Asha touched Jonas's arm. We light the signal fire when you're in position. You'll have maybe 15 minutes before they arrive. Jonas nodded. If this goes wrong, we know what to do. Caleb interrupted quietly. Papers get to the Vale woman. She'll know how to use them. Kofi stepped forward, his expression still skeptical but no longer hostile. You got more courage than sense, Jonas, but I respect it. Jonas managed a faint smile. Might just be, I'm too tired to run anymore. Mother Asha gripped his shoulder once, firm and steady. Then she turned and moved back into the trees with Caleb. Kofi lingered a moment longer, then followed. Jonas was alone. He crossed the clearing slowly, testing the ground beneath his feet. The earth was soft from recent rain, churned up by the fires and the hunting party's passage. He reached the limestone ridge and climbed carefully, finding footholds in the natural rock. At the top, he stood and surveyed the space. From here, he could see anyone approaching from any direction. The ridge's backside dropped off sharply into dense undergrowth, an escape route if needed, though he doubted he'd get that chance. He pulled the documents from the pouch and laid them on a flat section of rock beside him, making sure they were visible. Behind him, in the trees, smoke began to rise. The signal fire. Jonas waited. The sun was just breaking the horizon when he heard them. Horses first. The heavy thud of hooves on wet ground. Then voices, men calling to each other. Dogs barking in the distance. The hunting party was coming. Jonas's heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The first rider emerged from the western tree line, then another. Then the governor himself, pale and haggard, sitting rigid in his saddle. 6 men in total, all armed with rifles. The dogs stayed back, held by handlers. Vale spotted Jonas immediately, his face twisted with rage and something else. Fear, perhaps, or exhaustion. He raised one hand, and the party halted at the clearing's edge. "You've led us a fine chase," Vale called out, his voice rough. "But it ends now." Jonas said nothing yet. He waited until all the riders were fully visible, until he could see their faces clearly. Some looked eager. Others looked uncertain. One looked sick, like he wanted this to be over. "I found your shed, Governor," Jonas said loudly, his voice carrying across the burned ground. "I found what you've been doing." Vale's expression flickered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jonas lifted the documents high enough for everyone to see. Papers with your signature. Bills of sale for free people you kidnapped and sold. Names, dates, amounts. Everything needed to hang a man for trafficking. Several of the riders shifted in their saddles. One leaned toward another, whispering, "You're a runaway making desperate claims," Vale said, but his voice lacked conviction. "If I die here today," Jonas continued, projecting his words clearly, "these papers go to your political enemies. They're already arranged to be delivered. But if you agree to what I ask, they disappear. Nobody ever sees them." The silence that followed felt enormous. Even the birds had gone quiet. Vale's face had gone from red to grayish-white. "What do you want?" "Freedom for the families in the East Quarter. All of them. Legal manumission papers, filed properly. Safety guarantee for the people hiding in this swamp. No more hunting. No more burning." Jonas kept his voice steady. "And I walk away from here alive." One of the riders, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, spoke up. "Governor, we should—" "Shut up," Vale snapped. But his hands trembled on the reins. The horses stamped nervously. Dogs whined in the background. Jonas watched Vale's internal struggle play across his features. Pride warring with self-preservation. Rage fighting against political calculation. Finally, Vale's shoulders sagged slightly. "If I agree to this, how do I know you won't use those papers anyway?" "You don't," Jonas said honestly. "But I give you my word. I'm not asking for justice, just for people to stop dying." Vale's jaw worked soundlessly. His breathing had become labored, harsh. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning cool. 3 families, Vale said hoarsely. "Not all. 3 families get manumission, and you disappear into the swamp permanently. Those are my terms." It wasn't everything Jonas wanted, but it was something. It was more than he'd had yesterday. He opened his mouth to counteroffer. Vale made a choking sound. The governor's face contorted. His hand went to his chest, clutching at the fabric of his shirt. The horse beneath him shifted, sensing distress. "Sir?" one of the riders called out. Vale's eyes went wide. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then he slumped sideways in the saddle and fell, hitting the ground hard. Chaos erupted instantly. Riders shouted and dismounted. One ran to Vale's side, pressing fingers to his throat. Another began yelling orders. The dogs went wild, barking and straining against their handlers. Jonas stood frozen on the ridge, documents still in his hand, watching the scene unfold in horrible slow motion. "He's not breathing! Get the doctor!" "That slave killed him." The last voice cut through the confusion like a knife. The heavy-set rider who had spoken earlier pointed directly at Jonas. "He did this. He threatened the governor and brought on his death." Another rider raised his rifle. "Don't move!" Jonas backed up a step, his mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Vale was supposed to negotiate, to concede, to— "Drop those papers!" the rifleman shouted. Jonas's foot slipped on wet rock. He stumbled, tried to catch himself, and the documents scattered from his hands. They fell down the front of the ridge, landing in churned mud at the bottom. Two riders rushed forward, while the others tended to Vale's motionless body. Jonas tried to run, but his injured ankle betrayed him. He made it 3 steps before rough hands grabbed him from behind, yanking him off the ridge. He hit the ground hard. Breath knocked from his lungs. Someone jammed a rifle barrel against his spine. Metal cuffs closed around his wrists with brutal efficiency. He killed the governor. Murdered him. Bring him back for trial. Jonas tried to speak, to explain that Vale's heart had simply given out, that the confrontation had triggered what the doctor had warned about. But nobody was listening. They hauled him upright, hands gripping his arms so hard he felt bones grinding. Through the confusion of bodies and shouting, Jonas saw the documents. They lay in thick mud, Vale's signature slowly dissolving as water seeped across the paper. One of the riders stepped directly on them, grinding them deeper into the muck without even noticing. Everything he'd risked, everything he'd found, disappearing into Louisiana mud. They dragged Jonas toward the horses. His ankle screamed in pain. His wrists bled where the cuffs bit into skin. Behind him, men were trying to revive Governor Vale. But Jonas could see from their frantic movements that it was hopeless. A wagon appeared, pulled by 2 horses. They threw Jonas into the back, chaining his ankle cuffs to an iron ring bolted to the wagon bed. The heavy-set rider climbed up front, taking the reins. "Move out!" someone shouted. The wagon jerked forward. Jonas lay on his side, unable to sit up, watching the burned clearing recede behind them. He caught one glimpse of the trees, where Mother Asha, Caleb, and Kofi had disappeared. He hoped they'd gotten far away. He hoped they wouldn't try to rescue him. The sun was rising now, full and bright, turning the swamp golden. Birds began their morning songs. The world continued as if nothing had changed, as if a man's hope hadn't just died in the mud alongside a governor's corrupted heart. The wagon rolled toward the plantation, carrying Jonas back to face whatever justice white men would decide he deserved. The shed smelled of old wood and mildew. Jonas sat with his back against the rough planks, wrists still cuffed though they'd removed the ankle chains. A single shaft of sunlight came through a gap between boards, tracking slowly across the dirt floor as morning wore on. He'd failed. The thought circled his mind like a buzzard. He'd had the evidence in his hands. He'd confronted the governor. For one brief moment, he'd held power. Real power. The kind that made white men nervous. And then, it had all collapsed. Vale's heart giving out. The papers trampled into mud. Jonas dragged back here like an animal. Worse still, they thought he'd killed the governor. He'd heard the riders talking as they'd hauled him from the wagon. Murdered him right there in the clearing. Brought on the attack with threats. Should hang before sundown. Their words had been sharp with certainty, uninterested in truth. Jonas shifted position, trying to ease the ache in his bad ankle. The shed was maybe 8 feet square, meant for storing tools. They'd thrown him in here while they figured out what to do with him. No water, no food, just a bucket in the corner and silence. Through the wall gaps, he could hear the plantation continuing its daily rhythm. Hammering from the forge, women's voices near the washing house, children running somewhere. Life going on while he sat here waiting for death. Mid-morning sun climbed higher. The heat built inside the shed until sweat ran down Jonas's face. His mouth felt like cotton. He tried to generate spit, but couldn't manage much. Dehydration was setting in fast. Outside, boots crunched on gravel. Two voices, low and urgent. "Political nightmare," one said. "Governor's brother is already talking about involving the federal marshal." "Over a dead slave?" The second voice sounded skeptical. "Over the governor dying during a hunt. Makes the whole family look brutal. Senators in Washington are already asking questions about plantation practices. This won't help. So what happens to the big one in there?" A pause. "Depends if the governor wakes up." Jonas went very still. "Wakes up?" "Doctor says it's a coma, not death. Heart seized but didn't stop completely. Could go either way. Lord, have mercy." The voices moved away. Jonas sat in the new silence, processing this information. Vale was alive. Unconscious, but alive. That changed things. Not much, maybe, but something. If the governor recovered, he might still honor the negotiation. Or he might be even crueler, blaming Jonas for the weakness that felled him. If Vale died, Jonas would hang before sunset. Either way, his fate remained in white hands. Hours crawled past. The sunbeam moved across the floor, climbed the far wall, disappeared. The heat became slightly more bearable as afternoon shifted toward evening. Jonas's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. His head throbbed. He knew the signs of serious dehydration. He'd seen men die from it in the fields during hot summers. He tried not to think about water, tried not to remember the cool swamp streams, the rain barrels, the well near the quarters. Thinking about it only made the thirst worse. Shadows lengthened outside. The plantation sounds changed. Supper preparations, evening chores. Jonas leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Maybe they'd forgotten about him entirely. Maybe he'd just die here of thirst and save everyone the trouble of a hanging. Footsteps approached again. These were lighter, more deliberate. A woman's steps. The shed door opened. Lantern light spilled inside, making Jonas squint. A figure stepped through, silhouetted against the dying daylight. Evelyn Vale. She wore a dark traveling cloak despite the heat, hood pulled low. She carried a covered basket in one hand and the lantern in the other. Behind her, the door swung closed, plunging them into dimness lit only by her lamp. "Mrs. Vale," Jonas croaked. His voice came out barely above a whisper. She set the basket down and knelt beside him, producing a tin cup and a covered pitcher. Water. She poured carefully and held it to his lips. Jonas drank in small sips, forcing himself not to gulp, knowing too much too fast would make him sick. "Slowly," she murmured. He managed half the cup before pausing. "They say I killed him. They're wrong." Evelyn's voice was calm, controlled. "My husband is unconscious, but alive. The doctor believes he'll recover, though he's very weak." Jonas absorbed this. "The papers are destroyed. I saw them in the mud." She refilled his cup. "But that doesn't matter." "Ma'am?" Evelyn reached into her cloak and withdrew a leather folder. She opened it carefully, showing Jonas documents inside. Even in the dim light, he recognized Vale's signature, the same format as the papers he'd found. "I've kept duplicates of everything," she said quietly. "Every crime my husband committed, every person he trafficked, every illegal transaction. I've been documenting his activities for 3 years." Jonas stared at her. "Why?" "Because I knew someday his cruelty would catch up with him. I wanted to be ready." She closed the folder. "When you saved him during the first hunt, I thought perhaps you might be the person who could help end this. I gave you the locket as a test, to see if you'd notice the others in the shed. You left those there on purpose. I needed someone who could navigate the swamp, who could survive, who could think." Evelyn's eyes were steady in the lantern light. "You did everything I hoped for. The confrontation failed, but it revealed my husband's weakness publicly. His men saw him collapse. Word is already spreading." "What good does that do me?" Jonas asked bitterly. I'm locked in here waiting to hang. Not if we move quickly. Evelyn pulled papers from her basket. Different papers, official-looking forms. I've arranged for you to be listed as requiring medical transport. The story is you suffered severe exhaustion and injury during the hunt, and the doctor recommends you be taken to New Orleans for treatment. Jonas frowned. Nobody will believe that. They will when the doctor himself writes the orders. He owes me several favors. She tucked the papers back. Federal inspectors are coming in 3 days to investigate my husband's business dealings. I've sent word through channels my brother-in-law can't intercept. When they arrive, I'll turn over everything. And me? You'll be in New Orleans by transferred to a hospital that treats free people of color. I have connections there. Abolitionists, lawyers. They'll help you reach the North. Evelyn stood, brushing dust from her cloak. But we must move tonight. My husband's brother wants you executed immediately, before any investigation can happen. I convinced him to wait until morning by claiming the doctor needs to examine you first. Jonas tried to stand. His ankle protested, but held. Why are you doing this? Evelyn's face showed something complicated. Guilt, determination, grief. Because I've benefited from this evil system my entire life. Because I've watched men like my husband destroy people and faced no consequences. Because saving one life doesn't balance the scales, but it's something I can actually do. She moved toward the door, then paused. I'll return at midnight. Be ready to move quickly. The families, Jonas said urgently. The people in the East Quarter. What happens to them? The federal investigation will force changes. Some will gain freedom through legal challenges. Others, she trailed off. I can't save everyone, Jonas. I wish I could. And the people in the swamp? I've sent word through trusted channels. They know to stay hidden until after the inspectors come. Evelyn opened the door slightly, checking outside. Midnight. Stay alert. She slipped out, taking the lantern with her. The door closed, leaving Jonas in deeper darkness than before. He sat back down slowly, mind racing. This could be a trap. A way to catch him escaping so they'd have excuse to shoot him. But Evelyn's duplicates were real. He'd seen them, and her reasons made sense. She'd been preparing for this moment long before Jonas stumbled into it. Outside, the plantation settled into night sounds. Jonas finished the water she'd left, then ate some bread from the basket. His body began recovering from the dehydration, thoughts clearing. The lantern light outside faded completely as evening gave way to full darkness. Jonas sat upright, waiting. Midnight came with no moonlight. Clouds covered the stars, making the plantation yard darker than usual. Jonas heard the key scrape in the lock before he saw anything. Then the door opened, revealing Evelyn's cloaked figure, holding a small covered lantern. Quickly, she whispered. Jonas stood, testing his ankle. It still ached, but would hold. He moved through the doorway into the humid night air. Evelyn closed the door behind him and locked it again, pocketing the key. Walk beside me. If anyone asks, you're being transferred to the medical wagon. They moved across the yard toward the barn. Jonas's large frame felt too visible even in the darkness. Every shadow could hide a guard. Every distant sound might be someone raising an alarm. But Evelyn walked with complete confidence, as though this were perfectly routine. Near the barn, a covered wagon stood ready. 2 horses stood hitched and waiting, their breath visible in the cool night air. A driver sat on the bench, an older black man Jonas recognized from the stables, but didn't know well. This is Silas, Evelyn said quietly. He'll take you to the river town. He knows the route. Silas nodded once. His face showed nothing. No emotion, no judgment. Just a man doing a job. Evelyn produced a sealed leather packet from beneath her cloak. These are the documents. Everything needed to prove my husband's crimes. There's a federal inspector in Baton Rouge named Marcus Webb. He's expecting someone to deliver testimony about trafficking operations along the river parishes. Give these only to him. Jonas took the packet. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with more than just paper. How do I know he'll help? Inspector Webb is one of the few officials in Louisiana who can't be bought. He's northern-born and despises the trafficking trade. These documents will give him everything he needs to dismantle several operations, including my husband's. Evelyn glanced toward the main house. Lamplight showed in one upper window where the doctor presumably still attended the unconscious governor. But you must reach him before word spreads that you've escaped. They'll come after me. Not immediately. The medical transfer story will hold until morning. By then, you'll be too far ahead. She gestured toward the wagon. Get in the back. There's a false floor with space underneath. If you're stopped, Silas will hide you there. Jonas climbed into the wagon bed. Inside the covered area, blankets and medical supplies created a convincing appearance. Silas pulled back a section of flooring, revealing a narrow compartment beneath. It looked barely large enough for Jonas's frame. Hopefully won't need it, Silas said. His voice was rougher than expected, worn down by years. But best to be ready. Jonas settled onto the wagon bed instead, leaving the hiding space available. Evelyn stepped closer to the rear opening, her face partially lit by the covered lantern. When you reach the north, she said, tell them what happened here. Tell them about the families still trapped, about the trafficking, about all of it. Don't let anyone forget. What happens to you? Jonas asked. When they find out you helped me? My husband's family will be furious, but the federal investigation will protect me to some extent. I'm a governor's wife. They can't simply make me disappear. Her expression hardened. And I have copies of documents that implicate several powerful men. Insurance, of sorts. She reached up and removed the silver locket from around her neck. The original one she'd given Jonas, which must have been retrieved from his quarters. She pressed it into his hand. Keep this. Proof that at least one person in this cursed place tried to do something right. Before Jonas could respond, she stepped back and dropped the wagon's rear covering. He heard her speak quietly to Silas, heard the creak of the driver's bench as the older man settled into position. Then, the horses began moving. The wagon rolled slowly through the yard toward the main gate. Jonas held his breath, expecting shouts, gunfire, pursuit. But the guards on duty simply waved them through when they saw the medical supplies and recognized Silas from previous trips to town. The gate closed behind them with a quiet thump that felt impossibly final. They rode through darkness on dirt roads Jonas knew only from rumors. He'd never traveled this far from the plantation before. The world beyond the fence had always been theoretical, something other people experienced. Now the wagon wheels carried him into it, mile by mile. Dawn began showing gray light when they reached a small river town. Jonas smelled the water before he saw it. That distinct muddy scent of the Mississippi. The town consisted of maybe 24 buildings clustered around a landing where flatboats and small steamers docked. Silas stopped the wagon near a warehouse. "Wait here," he said, then disappeared inside. Minutes passed. Jonas clutched the document packet, every muscle tense. This could still be a trap. Silas could be fetching authorities right now. But Evelyn had seemed genuine. Her duplicates had been real, and she'd risked too much for this to be simple betrayal. Silas emerged with 2 white men wearing official-looking clothes. Both carried papers and moved with the careful authority of government agents. One was younger, maybe 30, with sharp eyes. The other looked older, graying hair and weathered face. "You're Jonas?" the younger one asked. "Yes. I'm Deputy Marshal Thomas Reed. This is Inspector Marcus Webb. Mrs. Vale sent word you'd be arriving with documentation regarding trafficking operations." Inspector Webb, the man Evelyn had named. Jonas studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. Webb just looked tired and businesslike. "We have a boat waiting," Webb said. "We'll travel upriver while you give testimony. The documents will be reviewed and verified. If everything checks out, you'll be escorted to free territory." "And if it doesn't?" Jonas asked. "Then we have problems." Webb's expression didn't change, But I've worked with Mrs. Vale's information before. It's always been reliable. Reed gestured toward the landing. We need to leave now, before word spreads. Can you walk? Jonas climbed down from the wagon, testing his ankle. It held. I can walk. Silas had already turned the wagon around, heading back toward the plantation without a word. Jonas watched him go. Another person risking everything to help someone escape. There were no goodbyes, no acknowledgments, just the work being done quietly in the darkness. The boat was a small Federal mail steamer, official seal painted on the wheelhouse. Webb led Jonas aboard and down into a small cabin below deck. Reed followed, carrying the document packet Jonas handed over. Sit, Webb said, indicating a bench. Start from the beginning. The engines engaged. The boat began moving upriver, water churning beneath the hull. Jonas felt the motion, that strange sensation of the world shifting beneath him. He was leaving, actually leaving. Jonas sat in the small cabin, exhausted but alive, while outside the boat moved steadily northward. His hands shook slightly as he began speaking, telling the inspectors everything, the hunts, the shed, the papers, all of it. Through the cabin's small window, he watched the shoreline slide past, cypress trees giving way to different landscapes, the plantation disappearing behind him with every passing mile. Jonas clutched the leather packet in his lap and kept talking. Several weeks had passed since the boat carried Jonas upriver. The settlement sat along a wide bend in the Mississippi, upstream from Louisiana's reach. It wasn't large, maybe 40 buildings clustered around a landing where steamers stopped twice weekly. But it was different from anything Jonas had known before. Black families lived here openly. Some were born free. Others had purchased their freedom or escaped north. A few, like Jonas, arrived through federal intervention after testifying in trafficking cases. The house where Jonas stayed belonged to a free black carpenter named Samuel Price. Samuel had built the place himself, solid cypress wood with a proper foundation and a porch overlooking the river. He rented rooms to newcomers while they found their footing. Jonas stood in the yard behind the house, splitting firewood. The work felt familiar. The weight of the axe, the rhythm of lifting and striking, the satisfaction of logs falling into neat halves. But now he chose to do it. Samuel paid him in coin and hot meals. The difference mattered more than Jonas could explain. "Jonas!" Samuel called from the back door. "Someone here needs help." Jonas set down the axe and wiped sweat from his face. Inside the house's main room, a young woman stood holding a small child. Both looked exhausted, clothing dusty from travel. The woman's eyes showed the particular wariness Jonas recognized, someone who'd recently escaped and didn't yet believe safety was real. "This is Miriam," Samuel said. "Came upriver on yesterday's steamer. Federal escorts brought her after she testified about a trafficking ring in Natchez." Miriam shifted the child to her other hip. "They said someone here helps people find places to stay." "That's Jonas," Samuel confirmed. "He knows the settlement better than most newcomers." Jonas nodded to Miriam. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over, run by a woman named Esther Webb. She's the inspector's aunt. She keeps rooms specifically for people in your situation. Hot food, clean beds, and she doesn't ask questions about where you came from." "I don't have money yet," Miriam said quietly. "Esther doesn't require it up front. You work it off helping with cooking and cleaning until you find paying work. Most folks stay there a few weeks before moving into their own places." Jonas gestured toward the door. "I'll walk you there now if you want." Relief showed in Miriam's face. "Thank you." They walked through the settlement's dirt streets. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off river mist. Jonas pointed out the general store, the church, the workshop where a black blacksmith did repairs. Miriam absorbed everything with cautious hope. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Few weeks. Still getting used to it myself." "It's real? They really can't take us back?" Jonas understood the question beneath the question. The fear that freedom was temporary, that someone would arrive with papers and chains. The federal marshals say we're safe here. Mississippi freed territory, not Louisiana. Different laws, and the investigations are making it harder for traffickers to operate openly. They reached Esther's boarding house, a two-story building with flower boxes in the windows. Esther herself answered the door, a broad-shouldered woman with gray-streaked hair and a direct manner. "Another one?" she said to Jonas. "Miriam and her daughter came from Natchez yesterday." Esther studied Miriam briefly, then stepped aside. "Come in. I've got stew cooking and the upstairs corner room is empty. We'll sort details after you've eaten and rested." Miriam thanked Jonas before disappearing inside. Jonas stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the street. More people moved about their business, buying supplies, heading to work, living ordinary lives. It still felt strange to witness. He walked back toward Samuel's house, but detoured along the river path. The Mississippi stretched wide here, muddy water moving steadily south. Jonas found a spot beneath a willow tree and sat on the grassy bank. From his pocket, he removed the silver locket Evelyn had given him. He'd carried it every day since leaving the plantation. The metal had worn smooth from handling. Jonas opened it, finding the space inside still empty. Evelyn had never explained what it was meant to hold. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just meant to be a marker, proof that something had changed. Mail had arrived from Baton Rouge 3 days ago. Inspector Webb forwarded a letter from Evelyn herself. Jonas had read it so many times he'd memorized the words. "The plantation has been seized by federal authority. Your testimony, combined with the documents, provided sufficient evidence. 17 enslaved families have been relocated to jurisdictions where they can legally pursue freedom. My husband survived the heart attack, but faces trial for trafficking. His political career is finished. Several of his associates have fled to avoid prosecution. I'm returning to Boston, where my family originates. The life I built in Louisiana was always a lie. Beautiful surfaces hiding rot underneath. I don't expect forgiveness for benefiting from that system as long as I did. But I want you to know that your survival mattered. You made this possible. Stay free, Jonas. Help others do the same." Evelyn Jonas closed the locket and pocketed it again. He thought about the governor, ruined and awaiting trial. He thought about the families scattered to different territories, starting over. He thought about Caleb and Kofi and Mother Asha, still hiding in the swamps because they couldn't risk testifying. So many people still trapped. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Not while the system existed. But Jonas had learned something during those days being hunted through the cypress swamp. He'd learned that prey could become something else when circumstances shifted. Weakness could transform into strategy. Survival could grow into resistance. Footsteps approached along the path. Jonas turned to see Samuel walking toward him with a basket of bread. "Thought you might be hungry," Samuel said, settling onto the grass beside him. "You've been helping people all morning without eating." Jonas accepted a piece of bread. "Just doing what needs doing. That's more than most folks manage." Samuel looked out at the river. "Esther told me about Miriam. Said you got her settled quick. You're good at this work." "It's not hard, just showing people where things are. It's more than that. You make them feel like safety is possible. That's a rare skill." Samuel paused. "There's talk of organizing more formally, setting up a proper network to help people coming upriver. They'll need someone to coordinate, someone who understands what newcomers are going through." Jonas considered this. Coordinating meant visibility. It meant risk. But staying invisible meant letting others struggle alone through confusion he could help ease. "I'll think about it," Jonas said. They sat in silence, eating bread and watching the river flow. Jonas thought about the night he'd entered the swamp for the first hunt, certain he would die there. He'd survived through knowledge passed down from Old Man Harlan, through his own strength, through Evelyn's unexpected alliance. He'd survived because enough people made choices that mattered when they could have stayed silent. Now he was one of those people. Someone making choices that might matter. The sun climbed higher, warming the river bank. Jonas stood, brushing grass from his clothes. Work waited. Firewood to split. People to help. A settlement to learn. Tomorrow the steamer would arrive with more newcomers. Next week, Inspector Webb planned to visit with updates about ongoing investigations. Jonas walked back toward Samuel's house, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet. The silver locket rested against his chest, a small weight that reminded him how far he'd traveled. Behind him, the Mississippi flowed endlessly southward, carrying water toward the plantation he'd escaped. Ahead, the settlement stretched along the shore, imperfect but real, a place where morning could arrive without dread. Jonas breathed the river air and kept walking. The sun rose over the water, casting long golden light across the current. Jonas stood on the bank and watched it climb, filling the sky with colors he'd never properly noticed before. Orange bleeding into pink, bleeding into blue. The whole world turning bright. He wasn't prey anymore, wasn't property, wasn't being hunted. He was just Jonas, standing free beside the Mississippi, committing himself to helping others find what he'd found: safety, dignity, morning. The day opened before him, full of work and purpose. Jonas turned from the river and headed toward it. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.